The decision of the United States to defend South Korea arose largely from a desire to protect US interests in Japan rather than Korea itself. How far do you agree with this judgment? The causes of the Korean War are complex and manifold. Many historians would argue that the decision of the US to defend South Korea against invasion arose largely from a desire to protect US interests in Japan rather than in Korea itself, whereas many would also argue that there are other reasons. Firstly, that it was due to America's foreign policy of protecting democracy, as laid out by Truman's speech to Congress. Secondly, it was part of the overall Cold War, North Korea itself being communist. And finally, that it was an outcome of domestic pressures from the United States. So we have an introduction here that identifies a series of points that need to be considered. One could consider having an opinion before we start, having planned this all the way through, knowing where we're going and how we're going to conclude. After the surrender of Japan in 1945, America had focused mostly on Europe in its policy of containment, as detailed by the Truman Doctrine. But it did also attempt to contain communism in Asia, mostly focusing its efforts on Japan. With the Red Army stationed in East Germany and Eastern Europe, Truman was determined to prevent similar communist dominance from occurring in Asia. Truman believed in the domino theory that if one country fell to communism, then its neighbours were sure to follow. With the recent fall of China to communism in 1949, the theory held that Korea was sure to follow, and then Korea's neighbour, Japan, would subsequently become communist. With its strong economy and adoption of capitalism, Japan was seen as a stalwart against communism in Asia. Japan was also a major economic investment and partner for the United States. Japan had bought $3 billion worth of US military material. America had also accommodated Japanese rebuilding with acts such as the San Francisco Treaty. Japan also needed Korea as a trading partner for its economic goods now that China had succumbed to communism. So to prevent the spread of communism and more likely to protect the United States military and economic investments, Truman made Japan the focal point of containment in the United States. Please note here the clear analysis and link back to the question at the end of this paragraph. The geographical location of Korea in relation to Japan was also a significant factor in the US decision. Much like how the UK was vital to the invasion of Europe in the closing stages of World War II, Korea could also be used as a staging point for a military invasion of Japan. To prevent a similar situation to that of Europe, with Soviet troops easily able to march into Germany and Western Europe, Truman decreed that it was vital that communist forces should not dominate Asia in a similar manner. Whereas in this paragraph here, the analysis could be made more explicit in linking back to the question. However, one could also argue that there were other reasons for the Korean War, such as the United States' desire to defend democracy, as shown by their cooperation with the UN after North Korea invaded South Korea. 2 resolutions were passed condemning North Korea and justifying aggression against them in the name of democracy. This means that America might have gone to war to defend democracy, although this point can easily be countered as the regime Syngman Rhee led was hardly a model of democracy. The only difference it had with North Korea is that it wasn't communist. Now again, the analysis here back to the question is not as explicit as it could be, whereas up here the analysis is clearer, though still again not as explicit as it could be. Also, the Korean War could have been seen to have been caused by the overall Cold War. North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, was communist, which turned the Korean War into one of ideology. With the fall of China to communism in 1949 and the Soviets gaining the bomb, the tide of the Cold War seemed to be turning against the United States. A victory was greatly needed. America felt that a victory would restore their place in the world above the communists. Although this point can be also countered, it may be incorrect to say that America thought Korea was an important theatre in the Cold War. In a speech made by Acheson in 1950, Korea was not mentioned in the important areas needed to repel communism. One must also consider the impact of Truman in explaining the reasons for the Cold War. The policy of containment was introduced in 1947 by Truman, as well as the issuing of the Truman Doctrine. Truman has seen for himself the failures of isolationism and had vowed to directly intervene for any democratic country threatened by the dark forces of communism. Domestically, Republican detractors at home criticized Truman for the fall of China, and to counter this, Truman decided to take some hard action. North Korea was a communist aggressor to democratic South Korea and was seen as trying to spread communism. This made the situation a perfect showcase for America's hard line against communism. In conclusion, some historians, though please take note here, these aren't named, believe that the decision of the United States to defend South Korea against invasion arose largely from the desire to protect US interests in Japan, rather than Korea itself, mainly to protect their investment, protect the American sphere of influence, and to prevent Korea from becoming a staging point for the invasion of Japan. Although other historians believe that it was a decision to protect democracy, a battle in the overall Cold War, and was due to US domestic issues. However, I think it's folly to support any side too strongly. No doubt the US was interested in protecting Japan, but they almost certainly had other motives as detailed in the final part of this essay. And reaching, therefore, a conclusion with opinion and an element of hierarchy, one could argue that had this element been apparent in the introduction, we would have had the complete essay package.